The sound of laughter echoing through my childhood home should have been comforting, but instead it felt like shards of glass piercing through my grief. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my mother's kitchen, watching a strange woman flip pancakes at the stove while my husband of 12 years sat at the breakfast table completely at ease. 3 days. It had been exactly 3 days since I buried my mother, and David had already moved his mistress into our house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jennifer Chen, and until this moment, I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I was wrong. Standing there in my own doorway, luggage still in my hands from the airport, I realized that everything I believed about my marriage, my life, and my place in the world was about to crumble in ways I never imagined possible. The woman at my stove had honey blonde hair that cascaded down her back in perfect waves, the kind of effortless beauty that took hours to achieve. She wore one of my aprons, the blue one with tiny flowers that my mother had given me for my first apartment. Seeing it on her felt like a desecration, another piece of my life being casually claimed by someone who had no right to it. David looked up from his coffee and had the audacity to smile. "Jennifer, you're back early. How was the flight?" His tone was casual, as if finding his mistress making breakfast in our kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. As if I hadn't just spent a week planning my mother's funeral, dealing with lawyers, and sorting through a lifetime of memories while he was here playing house with another woman. I set my luggage down with deliberate care, my hands trembling, not from sadness but from a rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. "Who is she?" The question came out calmer than I felt, each word measured and precise. The blonde woman turned from the stove, and I got my first full look at her. She was younger than me, maybe 26 to my 34, with the kind of confident smile that suggested she was exactly where she wanted to be. "Oh, you must be Jennifer," she said, extending a manicured hand as if we were meeting at a dinner party. "I'm Jessica. David's told me so much about you." David's told her about me. While I was selecting my mother's casket, arranging flowers, and giving a eulogy that left me empty and broken, my husband had been sharing intimate details of our life with the woman who was now standing in my kitchen, wearing my apron, cooking breakfast with ingredients I had bought. "Jessica is going through a difficult time," David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "Her apartment lease fell through, and she needed somewhere to stay temporarily. I thought you'd understand, given everything you're going through with your mother, given everything I was going through with my mother." He said it like my grief was an inconvenience, a temporary emotional state that somehow justified turning our home into a love nest while I was burying the woman who raised me. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Jessica returned to the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. "These should be ready in just a minute," she announced cheerfully. "David mentioned you love blueberry pancakes. I found the mix in your pantry." She had found the mix in my pantry. She had been here long enough to explore my kitchen, locate my belongings, and make herself completely at home. I watched her move around my space, with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, opening my cabinets to find plates, pulling my butter dish from the refrigerator, using my mother's antique spatula that I had brought home from the estate sale just days earlier. Every gesture felt like another small violation, another piece of my life being claimed and redefined by someone else's presence. "How long has she been staying here?" I asked David, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally showing the first sign that he understood the gravity of what I had walked into. "Since Monday," he admitted. "Right after you left for Chicago." Monday. I had left for Chicago on Sunday night, taking a red-eye flight because my mother's condition had deteriorated rapidly and the doctors said I needed to come immediately. She had died on Tuesday morning, holding my hand in a sterile hospital room while David was here, installing his mistress in our life like she was a new piece of furniture. Jessica placed a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of David, leaning down to kiss the top of his head in a gesture so intimate and proprietary that I felt physically ill. This wasn't some desperate woman seeking temporary shelter. This was someone who had been waiting for her moment to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. I should clarify, I said, my voice still unnaturally calm, when you say temporarily, what exactly does that mean? I directed the question to David, but Jessica was the one who answered. Oh, just until I can find something more permanent, she said brightly, settling into the chair across from David with her own plate of pancakes. The housing market is so crazy right now, you know. David's been such an angel, offering to let me stay here while I figure things out. David's been such an angel. She said it with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from private conversations, inside jokes, and shared experiences that I had been excluded from. While I was choosing hymns for my mother's funeral and writing thank you cards for sympathy flowers, David had been playing savior to a woman young enough to be my younger sister. I remained standing, my back against the kitchen counter, watching this domestic scene unfold in front of me like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. David was cutting his pancakes with surgical precision, avoiding my gaze, while Jessica chatted about her apartment search as if I was a longtime friend she was catching up with. There's this cute place in Brookstone, she was saying, but the landlord wants first month, last month, and a security deposit up front. It's just so expensive, you know. She looked at me expectantly, as if I was supposed to sympathize with her housing difficulties, while she sat in my kitchen, eating breakfast with my husband. The rational part of my mind understood that I was in shock. The emotional numbness that had carried me through my mother's final days was protecting me from the full impact of what I was witnessing. But underneath that protective barrier, a fury unlike anything I had ever experienced was building pressure, demanding release. David finally looked at me directly. Jennifer, I know this is overwhelming, but Jessica really needed help, and I thought you thought what exactly? I interrupted, my voice still deadly quiet. You thought that while I was burying my mother, this was the perfect time to move your girlfriend into our house. Jessica's fork clattered against her plate. Girlfriend? Oh no, Jennifer, you've got it all wrong. David and I are just friends. He's been helping me through a really tough time. Just friends. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. I could see it in the way she looked at him, the casual intimacy of her gestures, the fact that she was wearing what was clearly one of his t-shirts under my apron. Just friends don't move in together, while one friend's wife is at a funeral. Friends, I repeated slowly. And this friendship, how long has it been going on? David and Jessica exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that comes from people who know each other very well. We met at the fitness center about 6 months ago, David said carefully.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jessica was new to the area and looking to meet people. 6 months ago, that would have been around the time David started his new workout routine. The sudden interest in fitness that had him leaving the house at 5:30 in the morning and coming home energized in a way that had nothing to do with endorphins. 6 months of friendship that had evolved into the kind of relationship where moving in together seemed like a natural progression. Jessica was nodding along enthusiastically. David's been such a great friend. He's helped me learn the area, introduced me to people, shown me all the best restaurants. She smiled at him with obvious affection. He's told me so much about you too, Jennifer. About your work at the museum, your mother's illness, how dedicated you are to your family. My work at the museum, my mother's illness, my dedication to family. All topics of conversation between my husband and his mistress, my life reduced to dinner table discussion, while they planned their future together. The intimacy of it was more devastating than if I had simply caught them in bed. I had spent 6 months watching my mother deteriorate from cancer, driving to Chicago every weekend to help with treatments, managing her care from a distance while trying to maintain my career and my marriage. 6 months of exhaustion, grief, and impossible choices, while David was building a relationship with another woman that had now progressed to cohabitation. The restaurants, I said slowly. Would those be the same restaurants where David told me he was having business dinners with clients? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched the blood drain from David's face as he realized I was connecting dots he thought he had kept separate. Jessica looked confused, glancing between David and me as if she was beginning to understand that she had walked into something more complicated than she had been led to believe. Business dinners, she asked. David travels frequently for work, I explained, never taking my eyes off my husband. Or at least that's what he's told me. Lots of evening meetings with potential clients, weekend conferences, overnight trips to secure new accounts. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make David understand that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling in real time. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared down at his pancakes as if they held the answers to questions he didn't want to face. Jessica had stopped eating entirely, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth as the reality of her situation began to dawn on her. I pushed myself away from the counter and walked to the kitchen island, placing my hands flat on the marble surface that David and I had chosen together during our kitchen renovation 3 years earlier. Every detail of this room held memories of our shared life, plans we had made together, dreams we had built as a couple. Now it felt like a museum exhibit of my own naivety. "Jessica," I said, turning to address her directly, "I'm curious about something. When David offered you a place to stay, did he mention that his wife was out of town for a funeral, or did he perhaps give you the impression that he was separated? Single maybe?" Her face went pale, and I had my answer before she spoke. "He said, he told me that you two were having problems. That you'd been growing apart since your mother got sick. He said you were staying in Chicago to take care of things and that he didn't know when you'd be back. Growing apart since my mother got sick." I felt something cold settle in my chest, a crystalline clarity that cut through the shock and rage like a blade. David had used my mother's illness, my grief, my absence during the most difficult period of my life, as an opportunity to pursue another woman. He had painted my dedication to my dying mother as abandonment of our marriage, justification for seeking comfort elsewhere. "David," I said, my voice carrying a tone I had never used with him before, "is there anything you'd like to add to Jessica's understanding of our situation?" He finally looked up from his plate, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized from our early dating years. It was the same expression he wore when he was caught in small lies, the same mixture of defiance and calculation that I had once found charming in a man who bent rules to get what he wanted. Now it looked like cowardice. "Jennifer, you have to understand," he began, his voice taking on that familiar wheedling tone. "You've been gone so much lately. Between work and your mother, we barely see each other. I was lonely, and Jessica needed help, and it just seemed like what?" I interrupted, "Like a perfect opportunity. Like convenient timing, like a chance to play house while your wife was dealing with the worst experience of her life." Jessica pushed her chair back from the table, the scraping sound harsh in the tense silence. "I think maybe I should go," she said quietly. "This is obviously a private matter between you two." "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. "Please stay, Jessica. I think it's important that we're all clear about what's been happening here." David shot me a warning look, but I ignored him completely. For 12 years, I had deferred to his judgment, trusted his explanations, given him the benefit of the doubt when situations seemed questionable. I had been the understanding wife, the supportive partner, the woman who prioritized harmony over truth. That woman had died somewhere between my mother's hospital room and this kitchen. Jessica remained half standing, clearly torn between fleeing the uncomfortable situation and staying to hear what promised to be revelations about the man she had been involved with. I could see her mind working, processing the disconnect between what David had told her and what she was witnessing. "Since we're all being so honest," I continued, walking to the kitchen drawer where we kept important papers, "let me share some context that might help clarify things." I pulled out a folder I had put together for tax purposes, containing records of all my trips to Chicago over the past 6 months. I spread the papers across the kitchen island methodically, creating a timeline that told the story of my mother's decline and my response to it. Flight confirmations, hotel receipts, hospital parking stubs, pharmacy receipts for medications I had picked up, funeral home invoices. The documented evidence of 6 months spent managing a crisis while maintaining my job and my marriage. "This is what growing apart looks like," I said, gesturing to the papers. January 15th through 17th, Chicago, when Mom started her second round of chemo. February 9th through 11th, when she had complications and was hospitalized. March 22nd through 25th, when we thought we were losing her the first time. I continued through the timeline, date by date, crisis by crisis, each trip documented with the bureaucratic precision of someone who had learned to navigate medical and legal systems under pressure. Jessica was staring at the papers with growing horror, beginning to understand the context David had conveniently omitted from his version of events. April 13th through 16th, when Mom fell and broke her hip. May 3rd through 7th, when the cancer spread to her liver. June 18th through 21st, when we had to move her to hospice care. My voice remained steady, professional, as if I was presenting a case study rather than the final months of my mother's life. David had gone completely silent, staring at the evidence of my devotion spread across our kitchen island. These weren't the trips of a woman abandoning her marriage. These were the desperate journeys of a daughter trying to be present for her mother's final chapter while maintaining every other responsibility in her life. Jessica sank back into her chair, her face reflecting a growing understanding of how she had been manipulated. "You were taking care of your dying mother," she said quietly. I confirmed. Every weekend, every medical emergency, every crisis that required someone to be present and make decisions. And apparently, David interpreted that as an invitation to move his girlfriend into our house while I was at the funeral. The word girlfriend hung in the air like an indictment. Jessica flinched at it, but she didn't deny it anymore. The pretense of friendship had been stripped away by the timeline of evidence, by the reality of what she had walked into. David finally found his voice again, but it came out defensive and weak. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. You were always gone, always focused on your mother's problems. I felt like I didn't have a wife anymore." The selfishness of that statement took my breath away. While I was watching my mother die by degrees, holding her hand through chemotherapy sessions, managing her pain medication, and making impossible decisions about her care, David felt neglected. While I was writing thank you notes for sympathy cards and selecting readings for a funeral service, David was feeling sorry for himself. "You felt like you didn't have a wife," I repeated slowly. "So you decided to audition a replacement." Jessica made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The reality of her situation was becoming clear to her in real time. She wasn't David's knight in shining armor, saving him from loneliness. She was his backup plan, the woman he could turn to when his actual wife was inconveniently dealing with a family crisis. "It wasn't like that," David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Jessica needed help, and I needed companionship. It was just what? Convenient. Temporary. A way to pass the time while your wife was burying her mother." Each question landed like a physical blow, and I could see David struggling to find an explanation that didn't make him sound like exactly what he was. I began gathering the papers back into their folder, my movements deliberate and controlled. "Jessica, I have a question for you. When David invited you to stay here, to move into our home while I was at a funeral, did it occur to you that this might be inappropriate? Did you wonder why a married man was offering you such intimate access to his life?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking much younger than her 26 years. "He said you two were essentially separated, that you were living separate lives and just hadn't made it official yet. He made it sound like the marriage was already over. The marriage was already over." I felt something sharp and cold settle in my chest as I processed those words. David hadn't just cheated on me or sought comfort elsewhere during a difficult time. He had declared our marriage dead without bothering to inform me, using my mother's illness as evidence that our relationship had no future. "David," I said, turning to face him directly, "is that really what you told her? That our marriage was over?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "I told her we were having problems, that things had been difficult between us." "Things had been difficult," I repeated. "My mother was dying, David. That's not a marriage problem. That's life happening to people who made promises to support each other through sickness and health, for better or worse." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Jessica's quiet crying. She had begun to understand that she wasn't just the other woman in this scenario. She was a victim of David's manipulation, fed lies that made her complicit in destroying a marriage she had been told was already destroyed. I set the folder back in the drawer with deliberate precision, each movement calculated to demonstrate the control I was maintaining over a situation that should have destroyed me. But I wasn't destroyed. I was something else entirely, something I had never been before in my 34 years of trying to be reasonable, understanding, and accommodating. Jessica, I said, my voice gentle but firm, I think David owes you an apology. You've been manipulated into a situation that was designed to benefit him at the expense of both of us. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, confusion and shame warring across her features. I'm so sorry, Jennifer. I never would have if I had known the truth. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. You were told a story that made David's offer seem generous rather than predatory. You thought you were accepting help from a friend, not participating in the destruction of a marriage. David finally exploded. Destruction of a marriage. Jennifer, be realistic. We haven't been happy for months. You're never here, you're always stressed about your mother, we barely talk anymore. This marriage was failing long before Jessica came into the picture. The marriage was failing. There it was, the truth David had been carrying around for months, while I was focused on keeping my mother comfortable in her final days. While I was balancing work responsibilities, medical appointments, and the logistics of long-distance caregiving, David had been composing our relationship's obituary. You're right, I said, my voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. We haven't been happy. I've been watching my mother die, and you've been resentful that her illness was inconvenient for your social life. That's not fair, David protested. I supported you through all of this. I never complained when you had to cancel plans or leave town suddenly. You didn't complain, I agreed. You just found someone else to make plans with while I was gone. The simple truth of that statement silenced him completely. Jessica was openly crying now, understanding that she had been used as a weapon in a war she hadn't known was being fought. David looked like a man who had been caught in a lie so comprehensive that any explanation would only make him look worse. I walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden my mother and I had planted together during her last good weekend 3 months ago. We had chosen flowers that would bloom throughout the summer, creating a memorial garden that would honor her love of growing things. Now I would tend it alone, while my husband's mistress lived in the house where my mother had spent her final visits. I need both of you to leave, I said without turning around. Jennifer, this is my house too, David said, but his voice lacked authority. Actually, I replied, turning back to face them both, this is my house. I inherited it from my grandmother 5 years ago. Remember, your name isn't on the deed. The color drained from David's face as he processed this reminder. In all his careful planning of how to manage his affair, he had apparently forgotten that our living situation wasn't as legally complicated as he might have assumed. Jessica stood up slowly, pulling my apron off and folding it carefully on the counter. I'll pack my things, she said quietly. Jennifer, I am truly sorry, I never intended for any of this to happen. I know you didn't, I said, and I meant it. David made sure of that. As Jessica left the kitchen to gather her belongings, David and I faced each other across the space that had once represented everything we were building together. The breakfast dishes were still on the table, the coffee was still warm, and the morning light was streaming through windows that had witnessed 12 years of our shared life. What happens now? He asked, his voice small and uncertain. I looked at this man I had loved for over a decade, this person I had trusted with my future, my dreams, my mother's final months. I saw a stranger wearing David's face, someone who had calculated that my grief was an opportunity rather than something that required his support. Now, I said, my voice carrying a certainty that surprised me, you learn what it feels like when someone you depend on isn't there when you need them most. But David had no idea what was coming next. He had no idea that my mother's estate had been far more complicated than anyone realized, or that the quiet woman he had dismissed as emotionally unavailable had been laying groundwork for possibilities he couldn't imagine. He had made the mistake of underestimating someone who had spent 6 months navigating legal systems, financial institutions, and bureaucratic processes while managing grief that would have destroyed a weaker person. The woman standing in this kitchen was not the same person who had left for Chicago a week ago. That woman had been focused on being a good wife, a devoted daughter, a supportive partner who put everyone else's needs before her own. This woman had buried her mother, signed legal documents that would change everything, and walked into her home to find her husband playing house with another woman. This woman had plans that David couldn't even begin to imagine. But he was about to learn that underestimating someone in grief was the most dangerous mistake he could have made. The real story was just beginning. The silence in my house was deafening after David and Jessica left. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the unwashed breakfast dishes they had abandoned, feeling something cold and sharp crystallizing in my chest. For 12 years, I had been the accommodating wife, the understanding partner, the woman who bent herself into impossible shapes to keep everyone else comfortable. That woman was gone now, buried alongside my mother in a cemetery 3 states away. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in months. Margaret Torres answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Jennifer, I've been expecting your call. I'm so sorry for your loss." Margaret had been my mother's estate attorney, but more importantly, she had become something like a mentor during the complicated months of managing Mom's affairs from a distance. She understood things about family dynamics and financial security that I was only beginning to grasp. "Margaret, I need to ask you something about the paperwork we discussed before the funeral." I kept my voice steady, professional, as if I was discussing a business transaction rather than the complete restructuring of my life. The trust fund provisions, the property transfers, all those documents Mom insisted on finalizing in her last weeks. "Of course," Margaret replied. "Are you ready to move forward with the implementation?" Implementation, such a clinical word for what was about to become David's worst nightmare. My mother had been a woman of extraordinary foresight, and during her final months, she had observed my marriage with the sharp eyes of someone who understood manipulation when she saw it. The legal documents sitting in Margaret's office would change everything, but David had no idea they existed. "I'm ready," I said. "How quickly can we proceed?" "Given the circumstances you described, I can have the papers filed by tomorrow morning. The property transfers will be immediate, and the restraining order should be processed by Friday." Margaret paused. "Jennifer, are you certain about this course of action? Once we begin, there's no going back." I thought about David's face this morning, the casual way he had introduced his mistress as if she was a houseguest rather than evidence of his complete betrayal. I thought about Jessica wearing my apron, cooking breakfast with ingredients I had purchased, sleeping in my house while I was selecting my mother's burial dress. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. After I hung up, I walked through my house with new eyes. Every room held memories of the life David and I had built together, but also evidence of how I had consistently made myself smaller to accommodate his comfort. The home office that had become his personal space while I worked from the kitchen table. The garage converted to his workshop while my art supplies gathered dust in the basement. The master bedroom where his clothes took up 3/4 of the closet space. I began methodically photographing everything, documenting the current state of our shared assets for the legal proceedings that were about to unfold. David thought he understood the parameters of our relationship, the balance of power in our marriage. He was about to discover how wrong he had been. My phone buzzed with a text message from him. "Jennifer, we need to talk. I can explain everything. This doesn't have to destroy us." I deleted it without responding. 12 years too late for explanations. Another message appeared minutes later. "Jessica is staying at a hotel tonight. I know you're upset, but we can work through this." Again I deleted it. David still believed this was a temporary crisis that could be managed with the right words, the proper apology, maybe some couples therapy and a romantic gesture. He had no idea that my mother had spent her final weeks creating a legal fortress around me, anticipating exactly this kind of betrayal. She had watched David's behavior during her illness, noted his resentment of my time and attention, observed how he treated my grief as an inconvenience rather than something that required his support. "Men like that don't change," she had told me during one of our late-night conversations in her hospital room. "They reveal themselves when things get difficult." "Make sure you're protected, Jennifer. Promise me." I had promised, thinking she was being overly cautious, overly dramatic in her assessment of my marriage. Now I understood she had been preparing me for this exact moment. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the window, I saw David's car in the driveway, Jessica conspicuously absent from the passenger seat. He was returning alone, probably expecting a tearful reconciliation scene, where I begged him to choose me over her. I opened the door before he could use his key, standing in the threshold like a barrier between him and the house he thought he still had access to. "What do you want, David?" I want to come home, he said, his voice taking on that pleading tone that had once moved me to forgiveness. Jennifer, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can fix this. No, I said simply. We can't. You're not even going to let me explain. His voice rose with frustration. 12 years of marriage, and you're just going to throw it all away over one mistake. One mistake. As if the systematic deception, the months of lies, the calculated decision to move another woman into our house, while I buried my mother, was simply an error in judgment rather than a complete betrayal of everything our relationship was supposed to represent. David, you moved your mistress into our house while I was at my mother's funeral. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice that tells me exactly who you are. She's not my mistress, he protested. But the words sounded hollow even to him. It's complicated, Jennifer. You've been so distant lately, so focused on your mother's problems. I felt like I was losing you. You felt like you were losing me. I repeated slowly, so you decided to find someone else before I was actually gone. How considerate of you to have a backup plan ready. David stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, the same scent I had once found comforting but now associated with lies and betrayal. It wasn't like that. Jessica needed help, and I needed someone to talk to, someone who understood what I was going through. What you were going through. The words came out like ice. While I was watching my mother die, managing her care, making impossible decisions about her treatment, you were having emotional affairs with women who understood your struggle. How difficult it must have been for you, having a wife who was dealing with a family crisis. Jennifer, please. David's voice cracked with desperation. I know how this looks, but I love you. I've always loved you. Jessica was just what? A distraction. A comfort. A way to feel better about yourself while your wife was falling apart. I stepped back from the doorway, creating more distance between us. It doesn't matter what Jessica was. David, what matters is what you chose to do while I needed you most. I'm choosing you now, he said, reaching for my hand. I'm here asking for forgiveness. Asking for another chance. Doesn't that count for something? I looked at this man I had loved for over a decade, this person I had trusted with my dreams, my fears, my mother's final months. I saw someone who believed that good intentions could erase deliberate actions, that words could undo the damage of calculated choices. You're asking for forgiveness after you got caught, I said. If I hadn't come home early, if I hadn't walked into my kitchen to find another woman cooking breakfast, how long would this have continued? How long were you planning to play house with Jessica while telling me you were working late? David's silence was answer enough. This wasn't a moment of weakness, or a single bad decision. This was a sustained deception that would have continued indefinitely if circumstances hadn't forced it into the open. I need you to leave, I said. I need time to think, to process what's happened. To decide what comes next. Jennifer, this is my house too. My life, my things. Actually, I interrupted, this house belongs to me. It was my grandmother's property, inherited 5 years ago. Your name was never added to the deed. Remember, we talked about it, but somehow it never happened. The color drained from David's face as he processed this information. In all his calculations about how to manage his affair, he had apparently forgotten the legal realities of our living situation. You can collect your personal belongings this weekend, I continued, when I'm not here. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter when you're finished. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, panic creeping into his voice. I'm sure Jessica's hotel has availability, I replied, closing the door before he could respond. I watched through the window as he stood on my doorstep for several minutes, probably expecting me to reconsider, to open the door and beg him to stay. When I didn't, he returned to his car and sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the house, like he could will me to change my mind. But I was done changing my mind to accommodate David's comfort. I was done being the understanding wife who made excuses for inexcusable behavior. The woman who had buried her mother 3 days ago, and walked into her kitchen to find her husband's mistress making breakfast, was someone entirely different from the person David thought he could manipulate back into compliance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.